Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Helen Vozinidis, and I am one of the therapists working on the assessment-directed therapy program here at Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center. I wanted to extend my gratitude and appreciation for everyone joining in on this webinar entitled Principles of Trauma-Informed Systems of Care. Now, although I've presented before, it's never been through a web-based medium, so I won't necessarily have the ability to see or gauge how people are taking in the information, if it's resonating with everyone, if it feels as though it's making sense. So please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to write them down or type them down. And although this may have been a little ambitious in particular for a webinar, I've tried to include a small element of an interactive component at the tail end of the presentation. And just a gentle reminder that if you're calling in via phone, please make sure that your microphone is turned off. So I guess the first question is, what exactly are we talking about when we use the term trauma-informed, and why is it important within a Child and Youth Advocacy Center? And I just wanted everyone to take a look at the image on your screen and just to take a moment to reflect on what it is that you see. When I was first presented with the opportunity to discuss this topic, a part of me became really excited. My initial thought was that this webinar could potentially support CYACs to take a step back, contemplate their basic assumptions about trauma, clients, staff, as well as their organizations as a whole, and begin thinking about both the philosophical and theoretical underpinnings which inform their organization's culture and value system. Now, personally, I don't believe this takes place very often. And if anything, one learns about the basic organizational culture and value system through their observations and interactions with others, through what is said, not said, acted upon, not acted upon, rewarded or punished, spoken of, or simply that which is left unsaid. And so I thought if we as a community can begin to have discussions about the spirit in which we want to operate in, begin the process of making explicit and defining the guiding principles by which we want to conduct or carry out our daily interactions. And if those values or principles are adopted from the top down, then when we meet our clients, we can instill those values within our everyday interactions with children, youth, and families we meet from the bottom up. And it sounded lovely in my mind until I began putting this PowerPoint presentation together and reflected on my own personal experiences working within a CYAC and what this meant for me. And then came the moment of overwhelm. I realized that I had what I felt was the right language, but questioned if it meant the same thing to me as a therapist as it may for someone in law enforcement, child protection, court support services, prevention, and so forth. I can recall attending meetings, either here at the CYAC or outside in the community, where other service providers, and although there have been many meetings that have been positive, there have also been meetings where I left and questioned whether we were all on the same page. And that's a big question, in particular when your job is to support clients who have endured great adversity in their lives. It's like asking whether we see a duck or a rabbit, and sometimes there's a very spirited and creative soul out there who sometimes sees something completely different. So the question then becomes, even if we define the principles of what it means to be trauma-informed, how do you begin with the CYAC, the process of getting a lot of people from different backgrounds on the same page, using not only the same terminology, but speaking the same language, and embracing a well-defined, clear, and consistent framework from which to operate? So how do we do this? Or at least, begin the process of doing this, because I have come to learn that it's exactly that, a process. So how do we all get on the same page? First of all, I think it's important to think from both a theoretical as well as a philosophical framework to engender organizational change that is trauma-informed. This is necessary to cultivate an organizational culture that is explicit in its value system, from which all policies, procedures, practices, interactions, and so forth are aligned. The reason that it's important for things to be philosophically driven as well as theory-driven is because there needs to be a framework that can hold the range of diversity within our organizational structures. And within your CYAC setting, diversity in culture, ethnicity, race, education, area of practice, age, gender, sexuality, lived experience, you name it. With this diversity, the synergy of which generates our greatest strength and wisdom can also give rise to our greatest source of vulnerability and/or misunderstanding. We really can't take anything for granted or make assumptions that we're all on the same page. We need to be certain that we are all speaking the same language, and in my opinion, the reason theory and philosophy are so vital to this process is because there's no way a manualized script will ever encompass the range of possible experiences that one may encounter. So, it has to be something bigger and broader. A belief system from which people can draw upon in their interactions with one another, as well as with their clients and within their organization. A belief system that informs our interactions, and a belief system that helps us make informed decisions, even under challenging situations. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, a program is trauma-informed if the organization realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. This working definition is quite encompassing of many different things, and I thought we could break it down a little bit. By doing so, I hope to make some things quite explicit, and that is, we need to hold both elements of the picture I showed on the first slide in our awareness, both the duck and the rabbit. And in doing so, we can begin to see how those two pictures or images converge. And in essence, a mirroring process unfolds between our clients' ongoing growth and healing and the organizations as well. The other notable thing within this definition is that to be trauma-informed requires a commitment to understand the signs and symptoms of trauma. I do realize that it is beyond the scope of this presentation to go into great detail about what this means, and there may be upcoming webinars that will discuss trauma symptoms, such as re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks or nightmares, symptoms of avoidance and hyperarousal. But I also feel strongly that in addition to having an understanding about common symptoms, it's also important to understand how certain behaviors, including things like self-injury, beliefs about one's safety with people and trust in others, or outlook on life, have come to be as a consequence of adapting to a highly toxic environment. It's not just the classic symptoms. The reason this is important is because how you hold information will impact how you address or interact with your clients, and whether there is an understanding of things from a place of compassion and respect for what one encountered, versus a lack of understanding and possible judgment will inevitably impact how you orient to a particular situation. What you say or don't say, how you document things, your outlook or hopefulness regarding a situation, and then ultimately, what is conveyed to your client, their family, our work colleagues, and the spirit that thrives within the organization. But how often do we do this? How often do we take a step back and reflect on our beliefs, where they came from, the messages they convey? We hold a lot of power, and with that, sorry to quote Spider-Man, a lot of responsibility. I thought it would be helpful just to review the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I realize that many of you listening to the webinar are likely familiar with the ACE study, but it is such a seminal study that I thought it would be important just to touch on. It was conducted by Dr. Vince Belletti and Robert Anda in San Diego, and it was the largest study of its kind, including over 17,000 participants. The hope was essentially to understand the long-term impact of early childhood experiences across the lifespan. I think it's important to note that the average age of participants was 50 or older, and that over 70% of those who participated in the study were Caucasian, and over 70% had attended college. Areas of inquiry included household dysfunction, such as substance abuse, mental illness, domestic violence, and criminal behavior. The study also inquired into areas of interpersonal abuse, including psychological, sexual, and physical abuse, and both physical and emotional neglect. It was the number of categories, not the number of occurrences of these adverse childhood events, that was then compared to measure risk of various behaviors, health concerns, and disease. And what did they find? Findings from the ACE study indicated that almost 2/3 of participants reported experiences from at least one ACE category. 1 in 4 was exposed to 2 categories. And if you experienced one ACE in one category, there was an 80% likelihood of exposure to another. And please note that these findings come from a largely Caucasian, middle-class group of individuals. So the number of ACEs was strongly associated with adulthood high-risk health behaviors such as smoking, alcohol and drug abuse, promiscuity, attempted suicide, and obesity. ACEs are strong predictors of later health risks and disease, including heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. There are many things to take away from the ACE study that are aligned with the original definition of trauma-informed care mentioned earlier. The experience of trauma and early adverse events is perhaps much more common than people realize. In the past, and it continues to present day, much of the literature on trauma perceived clients as being deficient in some way, was pathologizing, or referred to people as ill to some extent, and did not take into account the impact of chronic stress upon the nervous system, all the possible neurological changes that may occur as a consequence to trauma, or the harrowing tales of surviving in an environment where those who are supposed to care, love, and protect you are the ones causing you the greatest harm. The other thing that the ACE study revealed is that when you return to the image of the duck or the rabbit, perhaps there is ambiguity between those two images because we are all vulnerable And it's not just our clients who have been hurt or harmed. It's also us. If not personally, then indirectly, whether through our work or perhaps knowing of a loved one or someone we care for who has also been hurt or harmed. And to quote John Briere, and for those of you who have never heard him speak, I highly recommend attending one of his presentations or seminars. But he says, we're all bozos on the same bus. I think this is humbling and inherently shifts some of the power dynamics that naturally exist as a consequence of our roles within a CYAC. But the other thing here is that perhaps there is something about trauma that engenders compassion. After all, the ACE score for those of us working in CACs or CYACs or other social service helping professionals is in fact higher than the average score for participants who were a part of the original study. Towards a philosophical understanding of trauma. John Briere writes that there is a basic assumption that the client is not mentally ill or suffering from a defect, but rather is an individual whose life has been shaped in part by ongoing adaptation to a toxic environment. Thus, the goal of therapy is less the survivor's recovery than his or her continued growth and development. An approach that utilizes the survivor's already existing skills to move beyond his or her current level of adaptive functioning. I think the point made by Briere is essential to grasp. There needs to be an understanding of the courage, strength, and fortitude our clients possess, an understanding of how things came to be, so that we are able to relate to our clients in a way that does not impose judgment, but rather understanding and reverence for what it is they lived through. And holding Briere's quote in mind, it becomes clear as to how the impact of interpersonal trauma creates adaptations in one's ability to relate to others, one's ability to feel safe, not only with others, but also in one's skin, one's ability to express their emotions, as well as one's ability to question what the definition of a just society is. The other point of importance here is that our clients also possess great wisdom, and yes, it certainly comes at a cost, but they are the expert of their experience. And if we listen closely enough, there is an opportunity to enlist our clients' already existing resources to support their ongoing growth. What this then means is, if we operate in a trauma-informed manner that holds this philosophy in our awareness, is that we refrain from making judgments about our clients and seek to better understand how things have come to be within the context of their lived experience of interpersonal trauma, and know that people are genuinely doing the best that they can in this one moment, but they also have the capacity to do even better. So never rule anyone out, no matter what the circumstances. And in saying this, we need to be mindful not only of how we interact with clients, but for those of us who work directly with clients, how we document our interactions with our clients, as this too can be an area of potential re-traumatization. Sorry, just one second. Go back. Okay. Within a CAC or CYAC, it is essential to recognize the potential impact of trauma on survivors, the developmental component associated with trauma, as well as the potential long-term impact of these events, as is clearly documented by the ACE study. We also need an awareness of evidence-informed practice to support our clients in their healing process. It is essential that those of us working with clients who have experienced adversity and trauma to recognize not only the potential immediate or more acute impact of trauma on our clients, but also recognize the potential long-term impact of these events, making our efforts to support our clients, in particular those who enter the CACs or CYACs at younger or earlier stages of development, incredibly important. We want nothing more than for our clients to feel safe, supported, and understood, so that if they require support in the future, because inevitably the meaning of their experience will shift and change as they become older and enter different stages of development, they will hopefully have had a good enough experience within your organization that they are more likely to access services again in the future if needed. So to be trauma-informed also means that staff within a CAC or CYAC, irrespective of roles, have a responsibility to familiarize themselves with how trauma impacts survivors. This includes ways trauma can impact the brain's architecture, as well as one's relational, sensory, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and even spiritual domains. So with this webinar, I am essentially challenging our thinking regarding trauma, suggesting that we need a much more holistic approach to understanding trauma that goes beyond equating trauma to the mere presence or lack of presence of certain symptoms. To be trauma-informed also means that those of us working within a CAC or CYAC would benefit from training and access to information on ways to support our clients along their healing journey, as well as an understanding of protective factors that can be enlisted to support clients. And this is not solely information that needs to come from the clinical realm by any means. For example, think about your intake form. Are they able to encompass the range of diversity that is also met within the CAC? For example, are the availability of different types of pronouns there on your intake form if a client is transgender or identifies as non-binary? Just simple things to think about that can make very large-scale, meaningful differences in someone's life. The ACE study also tells us that we are all vulnerable to experiencing trauma. It's not just our clients, it may be us as well. And as such, it's important to be sensitive to the reality that trauma impacts all of us at various levels, and it also impacts the systems in which we operate. As I mentioned earlier, the experience of trauma is widespread. It means that no one is immune. It can be judges, lawyers, therapists, administrators, teachers. It also means being sensitive to the ways in which entire groups have been impacted. For example, the Aboriginal community. And it also means being sensitive to ways in which trauma affects an organization, such as your Child and Youth Advocacy Center. Judith Herman writes that psychological trauma is an affiliation of the powerless. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. When the force is that of nature, we speak of disasters. When the force is that of other human beings, we speak of atrocities. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptation to life. Herman's quote is, I believe, an incredible definition of trauma because it highlights the impact of trauma on one's sense of control, connection, and meaning, but by doing so, illuminates what we within a CAC or CYAC can be doing, not just from a therapeutic standpoint, but cultivating within the environment and creating a collective consciousness around what we can do to foster healing, and that is fostering greater opportunities for control, connection, and meaning-making, not just for our clients, but also for those of us within the organization. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. So the other thing I wanted to highlight was the stress response. To be trauma-informed, it is also imperative to understand the stress response, not only to better understand our clients and their varying states of arousal, but also to provide a reflective window of opportunity to better understand ourselves as well as our organizational culture as a whole. The fight, fight, and freeze response are two primary response patterns in the face of threat. And activation of these responses is quite remarkable, and in many ways, we are not the same people when threatened as when we are calm. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we have a basic understanding of stress theory and the acute stress response. Most of us have heard of the fight or flight response, which is essentially an adaptive response to adversity. So, for example, if one is in a situation where there is some sort of threat, in an effort to survive the threat, one attempts to fight off the threat or flee the situation in order to survive, often referred to as hyperarousal. Of course, this is a highly adaptive response to threat. However, challenges arise when this stress response is triggered in the absence of a threat or if the threat is persistent. And you can imagine what this means for a child who has been saturated in trauma for years. Their baseline level of arousal will shift and change in order to adapt to the toxicity of their environment. And for many who have endured chronic abuse, this may mean that they will be in an elevated state of hyperarousal. Also under significant threat, when the fight or flight response cannot be recruited, because to do so would likely endanger a person, the brain stops integrating information from the outside world and adapts to the threat in preparation of being injured by dissociating and essentially shutting down, often referred to as hypoarousal. Again, if the threat is persistent and enduring, one's baseline level of arousal will shift and change in order to adapt to the toxicity of their environment. The other thing that's important to understand is that each experience of threat or danger connects to the previous experience of threat and danger in our mind. So the more fear and threat we experience, the more sensitive we are to danger. And if children are exposed to danger, fear, or threat repeatedly, then they may become sensitive to even minor threats, which can elicit the state of hyper or hypoarousal. And this is because memories of the traumatic event are not stored in our conscious part of the brain, but rather in implicit areas of our recollection. And that could be through a scent, it could be through a body memory, it could be through perception of fear with another, it could be in terms of proximity to another as well. So understanding the arousal continuum helps us understand our clients and how we interpret their actions or behaviors. For example, defining behavior as defiant versus fear-related changes the perspective from which we see things and engenders compassion. It also changes how we think about things in the moment, because when we are in a moment of stress or fear, our thinking changes. We become much more narrow-focused and reactive thinkers as opposed to calm and abstract. The other thing that's quite important here is that staff and administrators also experience stress. Hearing the stories of our clients, caseloads, financial constraints, the social and political climate in which we operate, personal dynamics between staff and both staff and administrators, as well as personal life experiences outside of the organization, all contribute to stress. We are not immune, and how we respond to stress, knowledge of the arousal continuum, and awareness of our actions is an important reflective tool. Our biological makeup is such that we too, not just our clients, may experience moments of hyper or hypoarousal. And without an opportunity to stand back and reflect on what this means for us, working within a CAC or CYAC, and why, in fact, it is important to understand what the accumulation of paperwork, workplace demands, organizational change, funding constraints, lack of open communication, sometimes mistrust between different professions or professionals, in particular when different disciplines are at the outset of better understanding one another, emerging policies that may not necessarily be clear, workplace dynamics, and I could go on and on. But all of these factors inevitably give rise to an elevated level of stress. And unless we are cognizant of how we are impacted by these factors, things can go on for us in a type of automatic pilot mode, affecting our workplace morale, hopefulness, decision-making process, level of trust and transparency amongst one another, as well as our feelings of safety within the organization. I think this is a highly significant point that cannot be stressed enough, because essentially, how can we, as an organization, expect clients to feel safe, develop trust, develop the ability to discuss their adverse experiences when ready, accept and grieve their experience of trauma, and instill hopefulness about the future when we, as an organization, are not able to do that for ourselves? It's a big question, and in general, the bigger your organization, the more hierarchy that exists, the more bureaucracy, and the more challenges in creating a trauma-informed system that does not replicate, at least to some extent, some of the challenges our clients experience as a consequence of their traumatic events. According to SAMHSA, a trauma-informed approach is distinct from trauma-specific services. It may include trauma-specific interventions, such as trauma assessment and therapy. However, it integrates trauma principles into the organizational culture. So yes, it is absolutely the role and responsibility of staff who have direct contact with clients to understand the nature of our clients' strengths, vulnerabilities, challenges, and ways past experience, both positive as well as adverse, impact one's present experience. However, it is the shared responsibility of staff and administrators to become sensitive and understanding to the ways in which past and present experience impact individual performance, leadership style, group performance, and group dynamics. It's imperative that we not only understand our clients, but also understand the organization in which we work and function, and how we may be vulnerable to certain experiences, creating systems that make things harder for clients to heal and for the work to be done. The reality is that we all have an organizational culture in which we are embedded. The question, however, is this the culture that you want, that you wholly embrace, or one that you would ideally like to see change or grow in a different direction? Or perhaps there are certain things that you hold with great value and other things that you believe would be rather better off reevaluated or reassessed. When researching the topic of a trauma-informed system, I was also met with the challenge of how best to discuss what this means, because there are ultimately different trauma-informed models out there. I personally felt that a review of each of the models might be confusing because although there are similarities, there are also differences, and given the time constraint of the webinar, I ultimately decided to focus on one particular model called the Sanctuary Model. The Sanctuary Model provides a clear and comprehensive framework that incorporates a strong theoretical framework aimed at shifting the organizational culture. The other reason this model truly resonated for me is because it makes explicit particular values, and it asks those within the organization not only to promote those values for their clients, but there is an expectation that those working within the organization manifest those values in their everyday interactions. It's essentially an expectation that you walk the walk and talk the talk. Now, the Sanctuary Model was created in part by Dr. Sandra Bloom, and the model proposes 7 value-based commitments that are inextricably linked to trauma-informed treatment goals. It is an evidence-supported model that makes explicit a mirroring process between the clinical work and the organizational culture. And there are 7 commitments that are designed to get everyone essentially on the same page by creating a mutually shared trauma-informed value system by which an organization operates. The Sanctuary Model also asserts that it's not just human beings, but also organizations that are living systems. So our organization, or CYAC, is a system that also adapts to a multitude of social, emotional, psychological, political conditions in very complex ways. And this living system is essentially our organization's immune system that is impacted by all the factors I discussed on the previous slide. The model helps explain how an organization's immune system can become compromised or ill, but also provides a framework for supporting our immune system to recover, heal, and grow, and in doing so, become trauma-informed. Here are the 7 commitments outlined by the Sanctuary Model. Although they are numbered 1 through 7, they are inextricably linked, and therefore, you can't really have one value or commitment without the existence of another. I would also like to share that although the model itself is not a trauma-specific intervention, the commitments are inherently related to a client's therapeutic process. So the 7 commitments are as follows. A principle of commitment to nonviolence. A principle of commitment to emotional intelligence. The principle of commitment to social learning. A principle of commitment to open communication. A principle of commitment to democracy. Principle of commitment to social responsibility. And a principle of commitment to growth and change. The idea of nonviolence is one that goes beyond the obvious of ensuring that within an organization, one's physical safety is always of the utmost priority. But the sanctuary model goes beyond this by ensuring that there is a commitment to one's emotional, spiritual, and moral safety as well. So what does this mean, and how does this translate into practice? Well, as I mentioned earlier, although the commitments are numbered in a sequential manner, they are impossible to extricate from one another. For example, you cannot experience safety without establishing trust. And within a CYAC, when a number of disciplines first come together, with perhaps different lenses and experiences informing how things are conceptualized, trust is something that needs to be actively developed. And what happens if during one of the multidisciplinary meetings, something is said that has the unintended consequence of hurting someone else's feelings? How does that get conveyed, expressed, worked out? Are there opportunities to process these events or experiences, or do they go unsaid or unspoken? And if so, how does this then impact the organization's immune system? How much trust and mutual respect is present within your organization? Just as safety and trust are essential to our clients' healing, so too is it essential for our organization's immune system to thrive. So for those of you sitting and listening to today's webinar, I would like to extend a gentle challenge for you to think about what are the circumstances within your organization that may trigger mistrust. Because without the ability to name, label, and identify our experience, then we are unable to move towards a process of tending to, repairing relational ruptures, and growing as an organization, which is aligned with the values or commitments espoused by this particular trauma-informed model. And from the sanctuary model perspective, when there has been a breach of safety or trust, because the model looks at the organization as a living system, the response would not be one of blame or finger-pointing, but rather that something is awry within the organization's immune system. So the question is not so much what's wrong with you and why did you do that, but rather what is happening from a broader context where behaviors or reactions are emerging that are not congruent with the values espoused by the model. And to draw upon a parallel process from a more clinical perspective, bringing the client into the framework of the sanctuary model, the perspective is one in which we would not ask the client what's wrong with you, but rather, what did you experience to help us make sense of your current challenges? The sanctuary model also draws on many theoretical frameworks, including attachment theory, trauma theory, and stress theory. The model recognizes and holds with great respect the emotional intelligence that is inherent to our work, working with survivors of trauma. This is quite noteworthy because emotional caretaking has been historically minimized, as it was seen as more women's work and something we don't get paid for if we are child rearing, or paid well for if we are in the social service field. But the sanctuary model places great emphasis on the commitment to emotional intelligence, but because it recognizes that it is hard work. Just by virtue of being in a child and youth advocacy center, we are working with highly vulnerable individuals, many of whom were repeatedly hurt and harmed by those who were supposed to be caring and protecting them. And as a natural consequence of the work we do, we are enlisted with the responsibility of sitting and being with another child's pain. And it is our role to create a container for that pain. And irrespective of our position within a CYAC, to some degree, we are required to empathize with our clients, support them to manage their emotional experience, all the while keeping our emotions intact. This is not easy to do. So, we have to have an awareness of what emotions are arising within us versus what emotions belong to the client to ensure we accurately assess the situation. And in order to help our clients regulate their emotions, we need to simultaneously regulate ours. We also need to have a way to check in with ourselves and be honest with ourselves when perhaps we may be holding more than we can handle at one point in time. So what does this mean in practice? Well, the organization should support those working within a CYAC to develop their own personal and professional strategies for bringing about change in key areas that will help reduce or prevent the process of burnout or vicarious trauma. And within a CYAC, where all our work revolves around trauma of children and youth, the commitment for an emotionally intelligent system is of the utmost importance. The sanctuary model is also dedicated to the commitment of ongoing growth and learning. The beauty of the model is that it holds in high regard the collective wisdom of those who worked within the organization for years, but also integrates new ways of thinking. And again, reflecting on the role of organizational stress, the sanctuary model would have one question how decision-making unfolds within an organization. As mentioned previously, in general, the bigger the agency, the more hierarchical and less participatory decision-making may become. This can sometimes also include policy-making that is perhaps more reactive to situations, and although may be perceived as helping to rectify a situation in the short term, actually creates greater challenges in the long run. And the other issue to raise here is, are the decision-making policies actually discussed with staff or clients if appropriate? Is the process transparent? Are those who need to be in the know actually in the know? And is open disagreement or healthy dissent welcome? Again, each of the commitments are interconnected. So, if we have a system that is impacted by chronic stress, where problem solving is more reactive, narrow-focused, and rigid, how does this in turn impact safety, trust, open communication, democracy, and so forth? Are complex problems generally tended to by enacting simplistic resolutions? Are people given the opportunity to share or reflect on their feelings regarding the administrative decision-making that directly impacts their work performance and quite possibly the client's progress? I've heard Dr. Sandra Bloom once say that the metaphor of the elephant in the room is a highly appropriate one, because if everyone within an organization has an elephant or a number of elephants in a room, then how much room is left for oneself to be present? Again, I hope here that a clear parallel can be drawn from a client's lived experience by virtue of having experienced a traumatic event that inevitably leads to a disowned sense of self. The therapeutic process would be one in which we would want to make things as clear and as transparent as possible for our clients. We would want to engender a sense of control and empowerment, that one is important and vital, but this cannot take place if we do not include our clients in decisions that directly relate to them, their process, and ultimately, their progress. The sanctuary model also holds dear within its principles that within the community, members recognize the importance of democratic decision-making and shared responsibility in problem-solving and conflict resolution, of all of which serves to minimize abuse of power and enables an organization to deal more confidently with the challenges of complexity in the world around us. So that is an overview of the 7 commitments. So the next couple slides will go over the self structure and the sanctuary toolkit. These are both ways that the 7 commitments are actualized within the model. So with the self model, I'll just go over what the acronym stands for. One is safety. So attaining safety in self, relationships, and the environment. The other way that they actualize the model is through emotional management, and that is by identifying levels of various emotions and modulating emotion in response to memories, persons, and events. And I think the thing that is quite noteworthy here is that this is not just for clients. This is also for staff within the organization. So clients are asked to think about safety in ways that they would be able to actualize that, but staff members are also asked to do the same. How they can be safe with others, what they need to do if they're not feeling safe, who they can approach, and so forth. And with respect to emotional management, it's not only clients that are asked to identify and label their emotions and being supported with ways to modulate their emotions, but staff as well. And then there's an emphasis on loss and feeling grief and dealing with personal losses and recognizing that all change involves loss. There is an acknowledgement of grieving painful things in safe ways so that individuals do not get stuck in the past. And this too is not just for clients. With respect to members of staff, whenever there is a loss of a staff or there is a transition in roles, there is a shift that happens within the organizational structure. And it's important that those things can be discussed and talked about, and if necessary, grieved. And then the F in the self model stands for future. And that is being able to envision things in more positive and optimistic fashion, and not just for our clients, but also for staff as well. Now, the sanctuary model also involves a sanctuary toolkit, and there's safety planning, community meetings, self-psychoeducational groups, red flag meetings, self-team meetings, and self-treatment planning meetings. These are ways that the sanctuary commitments are put into action. And I know that I've talked about a few of these already, in particular that of safety, but I can just go over the fact that there are regular meetings held with community members to ensure that communication is open and welcome. The self-psychoeducational groups are for those individuals who have been impacted by trauma so that they have some understanding of ways of making sense of their past and how that relates to their current experience to help them in terms of their recovery. The red flag meetings are essentially meetings that are called into action whenever there's a crisis. And the self-treatment meetings are an opportunity for staff, clients, and families to reflect on therapeutic goals and the progress that a client has been making and what else needs to be made to help achieve certain goals. And there's also, and I am sorry that this is missing from the slide, but there's also self-care planning. So it's not just for clients to identify how to take care of themselves in a more consistent manner, but also for staff to be able to reflect on what they need personally and professionally to help make their environment safer, and for them to be able to continue to do the work in the most effective way. So building a trauma-informed system. I think it's important for those of us listening in on this webinar to think about the following. How do we prioritize safety within our organization? If staff and administrators are not feeling safe, clients cannot be safe. Within your system, is open dialogue and debriefing around significant events or crisis situations allowed? Does this happen? How often? How consistently? Is there an emphasis on building trust and repairing relational ruptures within your organization? Again, how does this happen? How does it take place? How do you know that things are finished and that the process of repairing ruptures has actually taken place? Within a trauma-informed system, we also need to increase transparency. Are there some things that are not being shared? Is everyone that needs to know in the know? There also needs to be an awareness and addressing power dynamics within the organization, because it's important for people to have a voice and to be able to openly share their opinions without feeling as though that they will be made fun of, belittled, but knowing that their opinion will be held in high regard. And with respect to decision-making, we need to be mindful of including all relevant individuals, clients, family members, key staff when decisions will be made about their role, responsibility, or in reference to clients about their lives. And how are conflicts managed within the organization? Do things get resolved, or are things left unsaid? Does your organization welcome healthy disagreement? And is there an evaluation of staff morale? Are people feeling hopeful and inspired? Is there evidence of organizational unresolved grief? Is the general morale one of hopelessness or sadness? Have there been losses impacting the system as a whole? And this can include client suicide, loss of staff, or transitions of roles. Organizations have the capacity to evidence health and growth, as well as the potential to experience compromised health, mirroring that of our clients. In essence, manifesting symptoms of a collective trauma. If our organizations are living systems, then we have the capacity to reflect on our actions, decision-making practices, our interactions with clients, as well as one another, and continue to make positive changes. The clients who attend our child and youth advocacy centers have suffered greatly at the hands of those who were supposed to nurture, protect, and care for them. Despite the fact that we may be well-versed and knowledgeable in our respective fields, we have as much to learn from our clients, irrespective of age, as they from us about individual and collective healing, about how to reflect on our organizational culture so that it is more responsive and congruent with the needs of our clients, as opposed to propagating a deficiency model that does little to understand our clients and inadvertently mobilizes our organization around trauma and toxic stress. We owe it to our clients to continuously reflect on our practices, belief systems, and ways we organize ourselves. And yes, as mentioned previously, we are all part of an organizational culture but it is a question of, is this the one we want? And coming from a deeply relational perspective, there is no better way to consciously shift towards a more trauma-informed system of care than through a commitment to strengthening our relational bonds between our clients, staff, administration, and organization as a whole, and to make explicit how we are all connected to one another in this ever-evolving, very complicated, often challenging, painful, exhilarating, and rewarding web of life. So I thought we could possibly go back, and this might be the ambitious side of me, so we'll see how this works, especially in a webinar format. To see if we can go back and think about some of the questions regarding a trauma-informed system and how it is that your organizations may help manifest some of the principles of a trauma-informed system. I think that there's great collective wisdom here in cyberspace, and there's a lot that we can learn from one another. And even if we can take into, if possible, some discussions around how we discuss safety and how safety is embedded within our system, and dialogue around building trust and how we make decisions and the transparency that we might be able to provide within our systems. I just thought it might be helpful if we could have, well, we can see if we can have some discussion around that. Just 1 second. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them. I guess I can also mention that the sanctuary model is quite an in-depth model and commitment to learning. In order to become, I don't know if the proper word is sanctuary approved, a small group of individuals from one's organization would go and be a part of a training, and then they would return back to their organization and bring in a few more individuals in a group that would then become part of a steering committee. And the steering committee would then talk about the different commitments and ways that they would actualize those commitments into formal practice within the organization. And it's quite a process because after 3 years of attempting to actualize those commitments, there is a peer review that's done by the sanctuary organizing committee to determine whether or not you would then be certified in this particular trauma-informed model. And then that is also reviewed, I believe, annually or every couple of years. So there's a very strong commitment to what it is they're trying to attain. So I would just like to extend, again, my gratitude for everyone listening in today. I hope that the information was helpful. I genuinely appreciate your time, taking time out of your busy day, especially during this very busy time of year as well. And I wish you all well, and thank you very much. Have a lovely day.